Hi, welcome to this lecture, Spaced Repetition, Forget About Forgetting. I'm Soren Bjornstad. As the title suggests, if you are tired of forgetting things or struggling to learn things, you've come to the right place. But even if you're not sure that describes you right away, we're going to talk about how forgetting is really a kind of fundamental difficulty that makes any intellectual or technical field more difficult. And if you're able to forget about forgetting or even arrest it just a little bit, it will make the rest of your life quite a bit easier. So spaced repetition is something where if you spend some time learning it ahead of time, it's kind of a force multiplier for everything else you do. This is a lecture that I've given a number of times to organizations or groups of friends near me. I've decided to put it up on YouTube in a slightly different form for anybody who doesn't benefit from being near me to attend one of them. So here's just a brief high-level agenda of what we're going to cover here. So we're going to talk a little bit about the science of forgetting and how that works, which is kind of a prerequisite for understanding spaced repetition. Then we're going to talk about how spaced repetition as a general concept helps us prevent forgetting. Move on to a couple of tools that help us work with spaced repetition, Anki and RemNote. There are many more. This lecture is going to not exactly be focused on the tools. It's going to show them as ways that you can implement spaced repetition. But although I do recommend these two tools because they're ones that I'm familiar with and have used and in fact have been involved in the development of, I don't think that spaced repetition is something that can only be done with these specific tools. There are other tools, there are even non-software tools like paper Lightner boxes that can help to implement spaced repetition. So I hope if you don't like these tools, you don't feel that spaced repetition won't work for you. And I hope also that you don't become too cynical and think I'm only recommending them because I've worked on them, because I am totally fine with other tools as well. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about why all this matters, in case you're not clear on that, and give some ideas on how it can be applied to your own life. Before we move on to that, let's just talk about my relationship to spaced repetition a little bit to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. So I've been using spaced repetition for about 12 years, sometimes on and off. There have been gaps, but I've been using spaced repetition in some form most of the time since I was about 14 years old. You can do the math on how old I am now. I also was employed by the Anki project for 5 years when I was in college, mostly doing support and over the summers doing some development work. Also did a lot of work with the documentation, some of which you can even still see out there, though you won't know it was me. And as I mentioned, I've contributed to the Anki project. I've also written a lot of add-ons, many of which I'm still maintaining. Most notably LPCG, which is the Lyrics Poetry Close Generator for studying poetry or music or anything like that requires you to memorize text verbatim. I've also led or participated in multiple organizational Anki adoption projects, by which I mean explaining what spaced repetition and Anki is to a bunch of people in a school or a business and try to convince them to use it or find a way to make it part of their workflow. And just recently in January, I joined RemNote, which is an all-in-one tool for thinking and learning. It includes spaced repetition primitives. What I mean by that is that as you're taking notes in RemNote, you can kind of create spaced repetition flashcards and items just as you're typing in the notes. And we'll see how that works. So let's talk a little bit about how forgetting works. We'll start with the forgetting curve. Forgetting curve, as you can see in this diagram here, was developed by a German scientist named Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885. He did, I think, one of the more impressive self-experiments in scientific history. He created a whole bunch of nonsense syllables and tested his memory over several years, doing a bunch of different experiments with it by just trying to memorize these nonsense syllables and then reproduce them later. And what he came up with was a curve here demonstrating how quickly his memory dropped off for these. So right away, if he read them and then repeated it back, he was able to remember them almost all the time. But after only 20 minutes, went down to about 60%, 1 hour a little under 50%, 9 hours around 35% here. And as you can see, this starts to level off. So if you still remembered it after 6 days, you're only a little less likely to remember it after an entire month in this particular data set here. As you can see, this is an exponential drop-off, so it starts out dropping off very quickly and then slows down, and there's a mathematical formula that can be used to quantify that. Now, you might be wondering, just looking at this figure over here, well, gee, I don't forget everything in just 10 days. it seems like when I'm studying, I'm able to learn more than that. And so that's where we come over to this graph over here, which shows what happens when you review. So when you review momentarily, right, that's going to raise your chance of remembering it to 100%, because if you still remembered it, then, okay, you know it now. As you continue reviewing at periodic intervals, however, you can see following this drop off here that you can go longer and longer in between reviews. And this probably matches your intuitive experience, right? If there's something that you know very well because you've used it many times, even if you don't use it for a longer period of time, you're still going to feel like you know it well at a later date. And you can see here that this projected forgetting curve also continues down in this diagram here, showing where if you didn't review it again, how your chance might drop off. You may also notice another discrepancy between these two graphs, where this one is about 6 days, 20%, whereas here if you look at 6 days, it looks more like 75%. The reason for this is just that over here Ebbinghaus is memorizing complete nonsense, whereas this shows more like what you would get if you were memorizing something that actually made sense. So this drop-off is the more typical case. It's not really quite as bad as this suggests. It is still exponential, however. It just has a slightly slower drop-off. And nevertheless, 30 days, you're down to like 20%, which is still not great if you're trying to learn a lot of stuff. The key to spaced repetition is figuring out exactly where these reviews should be. And so that's what we'll move on to here. So Anki is a tool that can be used to determine where those reviews should be. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of different spaced repetition tools, and there's two that I currently recommend, Anki and RemNote. We're going to talk about Anki here first, just because it's a little bit simpler. It focuses specifically on spaced repetition flashcards, whereas RemNote also does a bunch of other things. So it makes an easier case to explain spaced repetition with. However, there's nothing unique to Anki about how it does spaced repetition. In fact, many of the other spaced repetition tools implement exactly the algorithm that Anki does, because Anki kind of came first, and that algorithm has proven to work well, and it's open and available for anyone to use. So as Michael Nielsen says in an article, which I will include in the description and talk a little bit more later, Anki makes memory a choice. This pull quote has now shown up on the Anki homepage because it's such a great summary of exactly what spaced repetition does. Typically, when you learn something, it's kind of chance whether you remember it or not. Obviously, you can increase your chances by using it more or by studying in a specific way over a period of time. But generally, you don't really have a choice about it. Whereas with a spaced repetition system such as Anki, you can choose that you're going to remember something. You put it into the system, and it makes sure that you carry out those reviews at exactly the right times to always keep your chance of remembering about 90% at the time that you review it next. So I say over here, Anki is as easy as 1, 2, 3. Choose what you want to remember, making your memory a choice, and add it into the system. The important step here, review daily. So you're going to look at the things that it says it's time to review and review them. And step 3, well, there's not really a step 3, it's just you remember the information. Your retention is going to be about 95%. The reason this is more than the 90% here is that if you just pick a random time along this graph, right, chances are you're going to hit a point in the graph where it's between 90 and 100%. And so if you do the math, it comes out to about 95% when your chance is 90% every time you review. Now, your chance is not always going to be exactly 90% every time you review. This is not an exact science. Your forgetting is random, which is why it is probabilistic, but up to a very high probability where if you put something into your spaced repetition system, chances are very good that you'll remember it when you need it. It is possible to raise or lower that to improve your chances of remembering at the loss of some study efficiency, or vice versa if it's not very important information and you'd rather study a larger mass of information with a slightly lower chance of remembering each individual piece. However, for most cases, this 90-95% is a very nice target. It's not frustrating, and it's still extremely useful because you're going to remember it most of the time. So just looking a little bit more about how this works with spaced repetition, we talked about how reviewing material at the right time is going to increase your chance of remembering, but it also vastly reduces the total study time you spend. So it's kind of a win-win. You remember better and you spend less time studying. Maybe sounds too good to be true. This has been studied since Ebbinghaus's original study, literally hundreds of times, replicated all over in different contexts. We still don't know exactly what the optimal schedule is in terms of, when you look at that exponential decay, like where should you place each of these? But there are algorithms like the one Anki uses that in practice work very well. We don't know if it's the best, but it works well. We do know that it works across basically any context. So one useful way to talk about how those points are scheduled is that the system schedules a review based on when it thinks you'll forget. So it's going to take a best guess at when you have about a 90% chance of still remembering it and say, oh, well, we better review this so your chance of forgetting doesn't start to increase massively. And most importantly, as we saw, the time between the reviews increases exponentially. So the fact that these are getting longer and every time is evidence of exponential growth, not just or exponential decay in the forgetting curve, but exponential growth in the amount of time that you can spend studying, which means that it's going to flatten to a more linear structure, right, where you're able to keep it at 90% despite not spending more and more time. The exponential growth works out so that you can maintain generally tens of thousands of items in just 10 minutes a day, as long as you add them over time. And I actually have a blog post up where there's a calculator that can kind of guess about how much study time you'll have to spend to learn a certain number of items. That is in my series of Anki posts. It's called How Much to Learn with Anki. And I'll link to that blog post, or that series of blog posts at the end of this video. Another useful way to look at this is, okay, if we want to learn one fact or item, that's generally going to take less than 2 minutes over your whole lifetime, as long as you select exactly what you're learning and how you phrase it correctly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, because it is quite important. A badly written item can take significantly more time than that. And one other metric that's sometimes used is items per year per minute. This is a kind of strange unit, but it's very useful. So this says if you spend a minute studying every day for a year, how many items can you learn for that? And depending on various factors such as how difficult your material is and how regularly you review, that generally comes out to be about 200 to 300. And this also takes in the lifetime review cost. So there's only about half of the total lifetime review contest. The total lifetime review burden happens after your first year. So you've already done half the total time in the first year, and so the remaining half gets spread over the entire rest of your life, which is definitely going to be many years in most cases for people who are using spaced repetition. So that ends up being just, a couple seconds a year on average after that first year. So it is pretty easy to roll that into this number. Let's talk a little bit more about how these tools actually function from the user perspective. So it is going to implement this via flashcards, which you study daily on a computer or phone. Maybe you're a little bit frustrated for me not explaining that earlier, where you're just sitting around going, well, what does this actually look like? I found, however, that for a lot of people, their brain turns off if they haven't heard of spaced repetition before and they hear flashcards, because they're like, oh, I understand how flashcards work. Spaced repetition is not about flashcards. Flashcards end up being by far the most convenient way to implement spaced repetition in most cases. Everybody already understands them. It's very easy to find small atomic pieces and put them on flashcards, which, as we'll talk about, is important. You don't want to have a large flashcard containing a whole bunch of information. So they end up being a very good medium to implement spaced repetition with. But it's not about the flashcards. You could do spaced repetition without flashcards, and if you do flashcards without spaced repetition, they're still a useful study tool, but only in the short term. If you have tens of thousands of flashcards and you're not using spaced repetition, they're pretty much useless because you're not going to know when to review them. So that's why I wait when I talk about this to discuss how spaced repetition in the forgetting curve works, and then we say, oh, well, there's an easy way to handle this with flashcards. Obviously, with a flashcard, you're going to think of the answer and then flip over the card and check your answer. There's an additional step in spaced repetition, however, at least in most implementations of it, where you say how hard it was. So over here, you can see there's 4 buttons. Once you flip to the back of the card, it's not just forgotten, remembered. It's, again, hard, good, and easy. So again is going to be I forgot it. Hard, good, and easy are different levels of kind of certainty or speed in answering. And we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to the demo. This just helps the spaced repetition scheduler make better decisions about how likely you are to forget it in the near future, and so it's able to schedule with more efficiency. You can create your own flashcards, or with basically any spaced repetition tool, you can also share them with others. Creating your own cards is generally going to yield better results. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but there certainly are cases when it makes sense to share the work with others. And I think it's important to get the most benefit out of a spaced repetition system to have your system open in the background and make it really easy to add new things. So whenever you learn something important or interesting, maybe you're reading or you're doing work or you have a thought in the shower or whatever, and you think it's something that you want to keep remembering, it's good to have it be really easy to add that into your system. You can certainly get plenty of value out of a spaced repetition system by just studying what you're learning in a college class, or only studying PDFs that you read as a researcher. But when you're able to move it to all areas of your life where there are things you want to remember that are interesting, it really, first of all, it gets you more interested in doing it, which is great because it does take quite a bit of motivation to keep up with daily reviews. It's totally doable. It's not hard, but you do need to keep that motivation or you won't do it. So it's beneficial for that reason. It's also beneficial because you're more likely to think of spaced repetition as a useful tool when it would be if you're already used to using it for all sorts of things across your life. Just as a demonstration of that, here are a few things that I've used spaced repetition flashcards to learn. A lot of people think, well, this is great for like learning foreign language vocabulary or medical terminology or something like that, but how could I use it for X? So here are some X's that I've used it for. We just talked about vocabulary, poetry and song lyrics, talked about my add-on LPCG. The way this works is it will show you a couple lines and ask you to fill in the next line. It's pretty simple, works pretty well. Physics, formulas, general ideas, abstract algebra, theorems in particular, but all kinds of different properties of different objects and that kind of stuff. History of the US and classical antiquity, tips for using software applications. This is really great. I often have applications that I don't use that often, and so I end up forgetting the cool tricks that I learn. Putting them in spaced repetition means they kind of stay at the front of your mind so that you're more likely to realize they're there when they might be useful to you. Programming languages, huge thing since I'm a software developer. There's a lot to know in programming languages. Certainly, you can look most of that information up when you need it, but it is so much more convenient to know it, and it makes you be able to write much faster and without kind of losing your place when you have to go look things up. A recent one I did here is BJ Fogg's Tiny Habits framework. This is another excellent example of keeping something at the front of your mind, which is a thing that spaced repetition does really well. So it's not just about, when I see this particular thing on a test, am I going to be able to produce the answer? It's also about, this is the kind of person I want to be, where I know this stuff, where I think about this stuff, where I do certain things in certain contexts. And so learning these tips for basically personal change helps keep me aware that it's something that I can do all the time, and also makes me notice when there's a problem with a habit I'm trying to create, what might be wrong with it. Of course I could go back to the book and read the book again, but like let's get real, I'm not going to do that. And most importantly, I might not even notice that there's a problem unless I actually have that in my head and being reviewed on a regular basis. So let's take a look at how this actually works. So we're going to start with Anki. We'll look at RemNote too in a little bit, briefly. So as you can see, I'm a little behind on my reviews right now. Typically I have about 70 to 80 cards in Anki per day and another 70 to 80 in RemNote. Right now I haven't reviewed very much for a few days. I've just kind of reviewed a little bit. Let's see if we can look at our statistics here. No data. I'm in the wrong folder. Here we go. So you can see that I was being very consistent for a while, and now I've kind of had a few days where I haven't done it or have only done a little bit. But 530 cards is not that much to get caught up on. I'll just study a little bit more than I generally do for the next few days, and I'll be back in there. Let's go ahead and just do some reviews so you can see what this process looks like. So I'm just going to start with all of my active cards here. So this is called a close deletion. It's just asking me to fill in the blank. This I happen to know is a tip from Dreyer's English, which is a really hilarious English style guide if you've never heard of it. So something's continual rather than continuous and that is if it's not interrupted. So continuous can deal with interruptions. So if it's periodically interrupted. So I have choices down here. I can say I forgot it. I can say I only barely remembered this. I can say it was about right, or I can say this was easy. And I had known this and then I forgot it a while ago, so I'm going to go ahead and say this is easy because I didn't have a lot of trouble remembering that. Here, this is fun. I'm studying where different neighborhoods and counties and streets are in Minneapolis because I just moved here. So it's going to ask me what this county is, and I believe it's Santee. Yeah, okay. This one was good. I wasn't quite sure about it, and it took me a second to think about it, but it also wasn't a real struggle. Azure networking, fantastic. In addition to the priority number, what priority consideration is given to rules within an Azure firewall? So there's like a system rule that comes on top of, I can't remember if it's called an application rule or some other kind of thing. Those come first. Network rules come before application rules. This one's kind of a judgment call. Depends on how much I care about the exact terminology. I kind of basically had the idea of it, but I'd still like to see it again pretty soon, so I'm going to choose hard rather than again on this one. All right, what is this tree? I probably should have text that actually asks what it is, but I'm able to figure that out. So this, I believe, is called a balsam fir. Yes, it is. That one was good. Kind of right in the middle. Had to think about it for a minute. Wasn't 100% sure. Was very confident about it still. So that one was good. This is dog called a wire-haired pointing griffon. All right, that one was good too. And so you can see we could go on for a long time here. I have about 550 of them, but we won't do that. That hopefully gives you the idea of how reviewing works. You can review on your computer. You can also review on your phone. Anki in particular has a very good mobile app. RemNote has one coming soon. Right now you have to work in the browser. The flashcards review experience is quite good on mobile in RemNote. The editing experience is not so great in mobile on RemNote. But like I said, that should be improving quite soon. So let's take a quick look at some actual flashcards. We can do this in the card browser. So I had a couple things that I thought we could look at here. So first of all, let's take a look at some cards about Anki itself, because that's fun and meta. So I have, for instance, mostly keyboard shortcuts here. So these are pretty simple. What's the keyboard shortcut to do whatever? One maybe worth noting here is this one about rescheduling cards. So I made this blue. This is one pattern that I use in order to say that this is changed. So in a recent version of Anki, the keyboard shortcut here actually changed. Might have been Control-Shift-R before for reschedule. I can't remember for sure. Anyway, now it's Control-Shift-D. And so to make sure that I don't give the knee-jerk answer that I was used to from before, I make the front of the card look visually different just to remind me, hey, there's something to watch out for here. And you can see that I've also put a mnemonic here. So Control-Shift-D stands for do. So when I actually look at this, I'm going to see on the front, what's the keyboard shortcut to reschedule cards? But the way I'll remember that is Control-Shift-D as well. It's to change the date the cards are due, or when they're supposed to come up so that you don't forget them. We can also look at close deletion here. So this was the one that we saw earlier about continual and continuous. The way you do that here is you use what's called a close note type. We'll talk about note types in just a second. And you add this special syntax here. There's a shortcut here where if you click on the close deletion button, it will pop it in automatically for you. But one thing that you can do here is you can have this show a queue. So this is the before-after part there. And then when you flip it, it's going to show after. So that helps you understand exactly what the card is asking for in that position. But I can never remember whether that goes first or second. And so this helps remind me that it's second. One of the things that Anki is really good at is highly structured information. So let's look at Latin prepositions. So Latin is infamous, you probably know, for having very complicated grammar, at least for speakers of most European languages. And so I have a Latin model for note type for prepositions here. It has a bunch of different fields. Is it 7 fields? Yeah, 7 fields. The first one is the preposition in Latin. There's 2 forms of this particular one based on whether there's a vowel next or not. There's the grammatical case of it. And then there's 3 different English definitions. I'll explain in a second why that's important. And then there's some derivatives. So this is like ways that this preposition gets used in English to help you remember. It's one of the really cool things that the Wheelock's Latin textbook does. And then if I came up with another creative mnemonic, I could put that here. And that would also show on the back of my cards, just like that do does. And so The way this works is if we do a preview here, we can see that it'll show which one we have highlighted here as we progress through them. The first one shows the Latin and asks for the English. And in this case, it's going to combine these three fields, right? Away from, and by. Then there will be three more here, which give just one of the English fields and the Latin one on the back, as well as these alternate translations. So the reason we split this up, or that I've chosen to split them up in this particular case, is in the case that we're trying to do recall, where we have the English version, or the version in whatever our native language is, and we want to come up with the foreign language equivalent, I'm probably not going to have the luxury of thinking the word I'm looking for is away from, or by, and so it's going to be artificially easy for me to answer that card, even though in real life I might not be able to produce the answer. And so that's what we sometimes call a false positive in spaced repetition, where you're able to answer the card correctly, but you don't actually know it. It's also possible to have a false negative where you can't answer the card, but you actually know the information. So this helps eliminate false positives by giving only like one of the possible definitions here. And then lastly, there's one that checks the grammatical case of it. So the way we generate this is with a special template. So we can specify all the different cards that we want to generate, and then we have a little fancy HTML, CSS, and templating language combined here that lets us specify exactly what we want to show on each card. And this can get pretty much arbitrarily complicated. In fact, we can even add JavaScript to them, and I've done this on a couple of occasions. So Anki is very good at this kind of structured information. I'm hoping that at some future point, RemNote will gain the ability to do that. Right now, it doesn't have a very good way of doing that for this highly structured information, where it's useful to put different things on different parts of the flashcards. As a kind of intermediate level, right, maybe more like what you would do if you're getting started with using note types, I have a note type for my English vocabulary that I run into when I read. And so you can see there's an actual word, a definition of it, an example sentence, and the source where I learned that word from. Now this one, there's actually only one card for each one, but it uses those for kind of formatting purposes, right? We want to be able to put the sentence in a different color and the source smaller at the bottom. It also just means if I'm searching for something, I can specify, do I know that it's an example sentence or part of the definition or whatever. For instance, I can easily find all the words that came from Dubliners, right, by saying, what's the field called? Source Dubliners, I believe I have to do asterisks. Yeah, and so then I can see all of these that have Dubliners specifically in the source field. Anything else with Anki that we should talk about? So we already looked briefly at the statistics. We can look at them again, but they're going to just offer you a variety of pretty ways to look at how you're doing and how your cards show up. There is a syncing service, so this will let you sync to both a very simple web app that will let you get a few reviews done on the go, but it's not full-featured, called Anki Web, and your mobile devices and any computers that you have, so that you can study on all of those easily. It is possible to get shared decks, so if we get a shared deck here, just a moment. Let me pop this up in a browser window here. There we go. We can see that on Anki Web, there's a place where people can upload all kinds of different shared decks that they have. I have one, I believe, called Unusual and Literary English Vocabulary. So anybody can just go ahead and upload whatever they have. And then you can come out here and you can say, hey, this looks interesting, and you can click download. That'll just download a file and put the file in, and then you can import the file into Anki in order to add it as a deck. I think that's all I wanted to show for Anki. Let's look at RemNote briefly, just so that we can see how it works differently and where it might be most useful to use. So as I mentioned, RemNote is really a note-taking app, an all-in-one thinking and recording information app, but it does happen to have flashcards with it. So let's take a look at one of the coolest things, I think, which is that you can take notes directly on PDFs and then turn them into flashcards. So here's an interesting article I saw recently called "The Bias in Behavioral Economics." It's a funny idea too. I haven't actually read the entire thing yet, but you can see that there's a PDF attached to it, which I can open side by side. And so I can take notes on the PDF, and they actually link up. So let's see that here's this libertarian paternalism idea here, right? When governments nudge people into doing things in a supposedly rational way, aimed at protecting people from their own irrationality. So now I want to go back and read, well, what exactly did the article have to say about that? So I can click this little anchor here, and it's going to pop me right here and say, here, governments need to step in with a policy called libertarian paternalism, and it will explain exactly how that works. And you know how I would do this over here is if I wanted to pop something over here, right, I could grab a highlight here, including experimental economists. And then I would push enter to add a highlight, and I'd say copy anchor. And then over here I can say, what are experimental economists? I don't know. And I can put I don't know. And I can put a pin there so that I can go back to it. There's also this option to copy the quote, which I don't use as much, but can be handy here where then it will put the full text of the highlight directly in there. And again, if you click on it, it will copy there. But so what this is really about, of course, is spaced repetition, right? But this actually is about spaced repetition. It's not just about note taking, because when you see these arrows, these are actually indicating that a flashcard has been created for it, or multiple flashcards in some cases. So looking again at the libertarian paternalism, right? If I click on this, it's going to show me edit your flashcards, right? And so there's two cards here. There's one that's forwards, asking what libertarian paternalism is, and one over here where it's asking you what is it called when governments nudge people into doing things in a supposedly rational way. And you can turn off one or the other of these if only one direction makes sense by clicking the button down there. And so as you can see, you can put these all over. It's also possible, as I had one down here, to do one that looks more like Anki, where there's actually like a question on the front and an answer on the back. And you can see what this one looks like too here as well. And so RemNote will go through and it will gather up all these elements from within your knowledge base and gather them together into a thing called flashcards over here. And so this works basically just like Anki, right? You have, again, hard, good, easy. They're called different things. And this one, which just says that you flip the card over too soon. You can do that in Anki too. It's called burying. It's just not one of the buttons there. So RemNote, I find, is absolutely fantastic for cases like this. I would say it's good for semi-structured information particularly. So this is where, like, you have a bunch of information about an article. It relates to each other. There's multiple motivations here. I want to be able to see all of these things together, really. So if I'm studying, let's study just this document so we can see something relevant here. Right, this is called stubborn persistence. The idea there's little that can be done to de-bias people. Well, what if I want to know more about stubborn persistence when I'm studying, right? In Anki, there's not really much we can do. It's just a series of disconnected flashcards. They might be tagged so you can go see the other flashcards. But what I'd really like to do is see my notes on the bias, or maybe even the original article, right? So in RemNote, I can go back and preview my document and see where that is. And so I'm able to keep all of this information organized together when otherwise it would kind of get chopped up into little pieces. As I said, Anki is better, I believe, currently for highly structured information where there's like a bunch of things that are exactly the same and you want to automatically generate cards from them. That's not something that you can easily do in RemNote at the moment. There's some support for it, but not a whole lot. RemNote is also not going to be all that helpful for you if you're just studying a bunch of really simple information like say German vocabulary, right? You want to know the German equivalent of English words and vice versa. Having a note-taking system like this is not really going to provide you with a whole lot of additional benefit. It might be a little bit harder to use since it's not just about flashcards. So I use both tools. I've been using Anki for a long time. I've only recently started using RemNote, so one reason I use both is that I don't want to try to import a whole bunch of stuff. But another reason is that I think each currently has their use case. I'm working on RemNote, as I mentioned. We're a fast-growing startup. We're improving this product very quickly, so it may be that changes in the future, and I don't recommend Anki anymore, unless maybe you just think RemNote is too complicated for you. But for right now, I definitely think there are strong use cases for both of them, and you can pick one or even use both for your own situation. Again, also, as I mentioned, the tool is not really what spaced repetition is about. There are even other tools. There's Mnemosiny and SuperMemo are two popular ones. Even like Quizlet has a version that works with spaced repetition. I believe you have to buy the Pro version and then turn it on. So if you just use normal Quizlet that doesn't use spaced repetition, don't recommend flashcards without spaced repetition because it's really pretty easy to add spaced repetition to them and they work a lot better. But there are even more options out there. I went back by mistake. Here we go. So let's talk a little bit more about like why we want to use spaced repetition now that we've seen how it works and what tools you can use to implement it. Hopefully you have some idea of why you want this if you came and watched a lecture on Forget About Forgetting, which we're now, 30 minutes into. But I think it's still good to discuss a little bit deeper in terms of why forgetting is an important factor in human knowledge and living well. So one of the big benefits is that spaced repetition systems, that's SRS, catch-all term for Anki, RemNote, whatever, makes initially learning things easier. So this is maybe kind of counterintuitive. It's not something that most people think about, but a big struggle when you're learning something new is having to pick up a whole bunch of terminology and basic ideas that more advanced ideas build on. And when you learn something like that without a spaced repetition system, oftentimes you end up having to relearn those things over and over again because you just can't cram all of it into your head permanently fast enough. Some of it starts spilling out your ears as you're learning the new stuff, especially if you have to dive into it very quickly. Or conversely, if it takes you a long time to get through the material, you're only able to read 2 pages a day. Well, by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you've already forgotten everything at the beginning of the chapter. And so with traditional learning, there can kind of be a perfect speed that you have to proceed through it in order to learn effectively, or else you're going to end up learning things over and over again. This is not the case for spaced repetition systems. Certainly there might be a speed that's too fast for you to learn everything, but you can, aside from that, you can pretty much learn at whatever speed, because once you've initially learned something and created appropriate flashcards on it, you're not going to forget it again, or at least there's a very low chance, and it's independent for each item. So that means that learning things becomes way easier. You just have to give yourself enough time to learn the first stuff, and then you won't forget it when you have time to start learning the new stuff. It's like, oh, I already know all this. This feels familiar. There's just one more step of things to learn in this particular level. This tends to make a kind of iterative learning workflow particularly effective with spaced repetition, where even if you maybe have some difficult materials, run through it. You don't have to understand all of it, but create flashcards for the stuff that's easy that you do understand. And then, study them for a couple days, get comfortable with those flashcards, and then go back and read it again. And then it will be much easier to understand because you do have those basics. And then maybe you'll be able to create flashcards for the next level. This is particularly useful if you have to work with something that's kind of above your level. But even with well-graduated textbooks, it can make your life easier. Certainly, if you have a textbook written for you and it's a good textbook, it's really going to do something kind of like spaced repetition on its own. It's going to make sure that it's organized in a way that you know each tier of information well before you proceed to the next one. And it's going to make sure that you go back to things that you've learned earlier and that you're using them as you understand new stuff. Unfortunately, even a lot of textbooks are not good textbooks. And there are many things that you're going to want to learn that don't really have a textbook, or you won't have the luxury of finding and using one. Speaking of textbooks, I recently wrote a textbook called Grok Tiddlywiki. Let's actually look at it quickly because it's interesting. It actually incorporates spaced repetition, not just in that implicit way, but explicitly as well. So if we look at, say, Tiddlers here, Tiddlywiki is a kind of knowledge management software. You're actually looking at a Tiddlywiki here. And so there will be a small section of information, right? And then down here, there's this thing called takeaways. So these are spaced repetition flashcards. As we can see here, there are only 2 options, forgot and remembered. That's just because this is the first time we've seen it, and it's easier to handle there. Even in Anki, there used to be only 2 buttons when it's the first time that you saw something. Sorry, actually 3. But here we just have forgot and remembered, but as we put these in, it is going to reschedule them for a later date, just like spaced repetition would do. The 2 we remembered, it's going to give us 5 days, I guess. Today's the 19th here. Whereas this one that I said I forgot, it's going to make me review tomorrow. And let me go in and just show you what it looks like when we review it too. Shift interval. There we go. So when I later come into the textbook on a following day, it's going to tell me, hey, you have stuff due that you should review again. Click here to start a review session. And then we're going to see a system very much like Anki, where it shows us the front and the back in a kind of question-answer format. And I can say forgot, hard, good, easy. I hope I've written a good textbook here, as I was talking about. If you happen to be interested in TiddlyWiki, you might check it out. I would be very interested in whether more resources could create systems like that. If you're interested in the idea of incorporating flashcards into textual information, you should also check out some work that Andy Matuszak has done called the Mnemonic Medium. He has a system called Orbit, which is another great spaced repetition tool. It is limited to basically importing material that other authors have created right now. But it's super handy. You can, much like I've done there, except you can actually embed it as an iframe in a website. So you can have whatever format you want for your article or your book, and you can just kind of embed these little widgets that create flashcards and then send them over to Orbit. So that's learning. There's a more obvious factor, which is that spaced repetition prevents your knowledge from leaking away when you don't need it for a while. That's hopefully kind of obvious, right? It's going to help you review things periodically, even if you're not actively using them in real life. It's kind of like creating an artificial test to remind you of everything that you would otherwise be forgetting. I think, however, that the benefits of this are kind of under-recognized. I know certainly in a lot of organizations, it's pretty common to train someone on something and then have them turn out not to use it, and then you have to train them on it again and maybe again. Similarly, a lot of us, at least in the US, have taken a foreign language in high school maybe that we then haven't really used since then, and now at this point we can't really speak it or use it anymore. I'm kind of this way with German. I've continued studying vocabulary. I still have a decent reading knowledge of German, certainly can't speak German well. Obviously, that's a little bit harder to do with spaced repetition. But so this is kind of actually an example in both directions, right? My active skills have decreased over time because I've never had reason to use them. However, I do still have a pretty strong base there in my head, which I can draw on if I need it, and which, if I were to decide tomorrow, I'm going to go live in Germany for a year, it would be much, much easier for me to relearn my speaking and listening skills in German than it would have if I hadn't been studying them at all for the past, gosh, how many years now? 9 or 10 years, something like that. So this is pretty much useful in absolutely anything that you might be studying. Could be keyboard shortcuts, could be German, could be a particular branch of math that you don't normally use, but then 5 years down the line, you're working on a project and you realize, hey, this is exactly what this obscure mathematical object that I learned about in college is for. So that brings up an important point, too, that one of the main benefits of remembering things is not just that you immediately know it, you don't have to go look it up, but that you realize it's a thing that you might need. That's one of the reasons that the internet hasn't removed the need to know things, is that for Google to be useful, you have to know, this is a thing that I should Google. And lastly, I have on here, remembering specific relevant information is pretty much the best thing you can do for your technical skills in any field, whether that's one that's intrinsically technical or not. It's common to think that those skills are mostly about experience, having done something many times, and thus having an intuitive understanding of how it works. But really, a lot of that understanding comes from knowing specific things. It might not necessarily be the stuff that you learn about in a textbook, but although some of it is intuition, a lot of it is based partly or entirely on explicitly memorized things from past experience as well. So if you get in the habit of putting that information in your spaced repetition system, that can really boost your learning process. So you're not relying on yourself to randomly remember those past experiences. You remember them explicitly. You choose to remember them. There are a number of different ways that you can do this. One that I like to do is if I make a mistake, I figure out what caused me to make that mistake. What specific facts, if I had remembered them, would have prevented me from making that mistake. Or similarly, if I just, encountered, I'm a software developer, a complicated bug, What things, if I had noticed them, would have caused me to be able to find the bug much easier than I did this time. So, at first, this feels kind of silly. It doesn't feel like it's helping. But if you keep doing this time and time again, eventually you'll start to notice that you're just getting better at everything and that you're likely to often have the information you need at the time that you need it. It works similarly to keeping notes on all of that stuff, except that it also provides you with the ability to remember that there is a thing like that, right? With your notes, it's kind of random if you remember that you have notes on it. But if you also export that to spaced repetition flashcards, you'll remember that it's a thing. And in fact, a pattern that I sometimes use is if it's really complicated, I'll just remember a pointer to the notes, basically, like, what website would I go to do this, to find this information, or, what should I search for? What is this problem called? And that's also a very useful pattern in the internet age, where it's like, okay, I don't need to know the details of this, but I do need to know that it's a thing and how to get those details when I need them. Another question you might be asking is like, okay, so if this is so great, if it's going to help me learn things way easier, prevent me from forgetting things, and improve my technical skills, like, why isn't everyone doing this already? And I think there are a number of answers to this. The simplest is just people don't know it exists. That has been changing rapidly in the past couple of years. At this point, I think I saw a recent survey of med school students, and it was about 50% of them knew about Anki or had used it. So that's certainly a huge improvement, but right now it is still kind of confined to a few specific fields like maybe law or language learning, things where it's well known that you need to cram a lot of stuff into your head, and so people will know to look for solutions for doing that. Nevertheless, spaced repetition is also getting incorporated into a lot of other products and tools, sometimes by that name. And so I think this is beginning to change. It's not a complete excuse for why everyone isn't using it anymore. It's also worth noting that SuperMemo has been available since the mid-'80s. So there's certainly been plenty of time for people to learn it exists. So there has to be something else going on as well. Another big thing, I think, is there's a daily commitment to reviewing. As I showed you with my Anki, I haven't reviewed that particular application for a little while, and that's not a disaster as long as you don't let it pile up for tens of thousands of cards. Even if that happens, it's not a complete disaster. It's not an unrecoverable disaster, but it does require quite a lot of work to pick it up again. Certainly, you're going to remember things better. At review time with a higher frequency, and just in general get more out of it, and it's going to feel easier if you review daily or as close to daily as possible. Given the number of people who can't get themselves to do much simpler things every day, like floss their teeth, it's probably not that surprising. I think there are definitely ways to make it easier. One really important thing is just make sure that you're always studying things that you find interesting. That's going to increase your motivation. If you have fun studying your flashcards and you're seeing immediate results because you're learning things that you use daily, that's really going to keep you doing it. Motivation is really the key element in creating a habit, in addition to remembering to do it and it being easy enough to do. So when you make flashcards, it's important to make them good flashcards. This is going to tackle the ability component, right? And not add too many of them. And I'll talk about a reference that explains more about what good flashcards are, because I didn't talk about that in the demo. I didn't feel we needed to, but it is something that if you want to get started with spaced repetition is really important that you pay attention to. Otherwise, it's basically just not going to work well for you, and then you'll think that spaced repetition is terrible, this lecture aside. It's also very helpful just to come up with a time daily that you do your reviews. If you have the mobile app, if you have a smartphone, it's great, if you ride the bus to work, or you stand in line a lot during the day or something. If you make studying your flashcards something you do at those times, other people will do them right before they go to bed, or when they get up while they're drinking coffee in the morning or something like that. I've done all of these things at different times in my life. It just kind of fits whatever fits best into my current schedule and way of living and working. So it's something that you can overcome pretty easily by being intentional about it. You do have to be intentional about it. You can't just kind of trust that you're going to do it, or it's really not going to happen. And then again, it stops working as well. It feels really hard, which gets to this next point, and then people stop using it, even if they did use it. Spaced repetition feels harder than cramming or just rereading the information, even though it's absolutely no contest if you study it. It works way better in pretty much every case. The one time that cramming is better is if you need to know something tomorrow. Spaced repetition is not going to help you because there's not really any time to space it over. In that case, you should cram if it's less than a couple days. But if you want to know something for the long term, spaced repetition is way better. Nevertheless, like I said, it feels harder. And the reason for this is that spaced repetition is going to not show you the stuff that you already know. It's just going to show you the stuff that you don't know, that you're frequently forgetting, that's difficult. And so it often feels like it's not working. It feels like, oh, I'm not remembering this. Well, that's because you're only seeing the stuff that you're not remembering. You're seeing the hardest 10 or 15%, like 50% of the time, because that's the stuff you need to review more. And the stuff that's easy just doesn't show up anymore because you just know it. So I think it's useful to be aware of this effect. Another way that you can avoid falling into this trap and feeling like it's not working is just telling yourself, okay, I'm going to pick something that I'm really excited about, like maybe a new hobby, where there's some stuff that it's useful to remember. And I'm going to try it for 4 weeks. And then at the end, we're going to see like how much I know. You don't have to necessarily test yourself. Honestly, if it's something that you're using frequently and that you're excited about, you're probably just going to know like, oh, I know that now. It's, I think, generally subjectively obvious. But you give yourself that time so that you can actually evaluate how you learned it rather than trying to just do it over time as it happens. You're often going to come to the wrong conclusion that way because it does feel harder while reviewing. Lastly, even if you take these things into account, it's easy to use poorly. Like I mentioned, there are good flashcards and bad flashcards. Bad flashcards are very easy to create. They feel like intuitively maybe what you should be doing, but they're not at all. And so oftentimes people will just download a tool like Anki. It's not necessarily obvious exactly how to use Anki. Here's a place where you can add your own flashcards. Here's a place where you can download other people's flashcards. A lot of the other people's flashcards that you find on the internet are bad flashcards. That's often how people want to start with using Anki, right? They're like, well, let's start by making this easier. I'll just focus on the studying part, and I won't focus on having to create flashcards. Well, then they download something maybe that they aren't particularly excited about learning. A common thing that people do is they'll download something like, all of the U.S. presidents or the periodic table of elements, right? They're things that we often think about explicitly memorizing. So you're like, oh, this is kind of cool. I'll learn one of these things. But most of the time people aren't really excited about those things. We feel like we should learn the presidents out of civic duty or something. And it's like, well, I don't know. Might be kind of cool to know them. I'm not bashing the U.S. presidents. I think it would be cool to know all the presidents of the United States. But I'm not really excited about knowing them. I'm certainly excited about knowing things that are going to help me work better. I'm excited about learning more about my hobbies. So those are things that you want to start with. Most people don't explicitly memorize very many things. They just kind of rely on chance for that to happen. And so it's not always obvious to see what should I use it for. And so, as I said, I think you should use it for things that excite you, at least to begin with. Later maybe you'll end up using it for boring exams that you have to take for your work or something. But even if you do that, it's important to make sure there continues to be a balance there, where some of the stuff is the boring stuff and some of the stuff is the exciting stuff, so that you can keep up that motivation to do your reviews daily. It's also possible, if you have to take an exam but you don't really care about the material, when you're done with the exam, you can just remove it from your collection or just suspend it so that you're not reviewing. That's something you can do in most apps. You can keep the material around but tell it, oh, I don't need to know this right now, so don't show it to me. Again, just to keep that motivation up. I probably sound like I'm harping on this, but it really is key. All right, so let's talk about some resources for learning more here. I do have a series of blog posts here getting started with Anki, and I don't have anything up there about RemNote currently because it's something actually fairly new to me. I do hope to update those articles so that it talks about how to do those things in both Anki and RemNote at some point, but I think you can probably, if you learn RemNote and then you read those articles, you can figure out pretty easily how to adapt it. Similarly, if you use Mosny or SuperMemo or what have you. There's a really good article here about called Augmenting Long-Term Memory by Michael Nielsen. This is the source of both the quotes about Anki that I put in here. Super worth reading if you found this lecture interesting at all. In particular, it's going to talk about more about how you choose what to learn and how to manage motivation and just kind of those sorts of practical things, as well as what makes good flashcards, what things are important to consider when you design them. If you're interested in programming specifically, which is a common use for people who end up looking up stuff like how to memorize stuff, there's a good article by Derek Sivers here on that. If you want to see more of the science, Spaced Repetition for Effective Learning by Gwern, Rationalist website, it's a extensive literature review. There's probably at least 50, maybe 100 different articles that he looked at, and also just some practical tips on then actually using spaced repetition. 20 Rules of Formulating Knowledge in Learning. This is by the author of Super Memo. Crazy guy, very fun to look at some of his stuff. He has a bunch of articles on other things like sleep that are like a mile long and they're just one page. If you can get through them, those are fascinating too. This is all about practical rules for creating useful flashcards. So this is how you're going to learn how to create a good flashcard, at least in the traditional sense. So in the traditional sense, I mean, RemNote has a slightly different model, right, where you're writing notes, but you're still going to have a front of the flashcard and a back of a flashcard. So most of that material, most of that information should mostly transfer over to RemNote as well. There are a few things that I don't know how to do well in that RemNote model yet. Like I said, I'm still learning that as well, and that model is probably going to be flexible and adapt over the next year or two also. And I will have links here for getting started with Anki and getting started with RemNote also in the description of this video. Those are just going to take you to where you can go try them out. Thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful, and hopefully this also gives you a good way to get started if you're looking for actionable things to do at this point. Read some of these articles, but don't even bother reading the articles if you think that's going to put you off from doing it. Grab one of the tools and try getting started with it. Find something that you're excited to learn, that you need to learn right now, and try creating some flashcards for it. And then as you have done a little bit of that, you see what's working and what's not, you can start circling around and learning the 20 rules. If you're not sure how to actually get started, I do have this post, Getting Started with Anki, which will show you like how to download it and start creating things. Thank you.